welcome back. You are joining us for the third segment of our episode that I'm titling The Queen is Dead, Long Live the King, where we are analyzing the political transition in England from the perspective of Bible prophecy and maybe trying to figure out what's really going on here. So I'm going to start our segment by telling you Britain is fragile. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, broadly, generally, we're living right now in a time where kingdom will rise against kingdom. And hopefully that triggers your memory of our first episode where we talked about that from Matthew chapter 24. And you may remember that I pointed us to the Old Testament book of Isaiah, chapter 19, verse 2, which Jesus appears to be referencing when he makes this comment about kingdom will rise against kingdom. We saw in Isaiah 19 that phraseology is pointing not to international warfare, but intra-national warfare, civil unrest, kingdom A against itself. So broadly and generally, everybody, every nation, everywhere is fragile because we're living in this prophetic moment where everybody's just turning on each other. But we can be more specific than that. Britain is fragile because you remember that it just broke itself off from the European Union a couple years ago, and they took the vote to do that way back in 2015 and then argued and bickered about it for several years before it actually happened. So England exists in this paradigm where it's kind of part of Europe, but also kind of not part of Europe, and its internal politics are frayed and fraught and divided. And right now I was just reading a very interesting description of the demographics of the people who constitute the British government and how it is very different than it used to be in the past. So it is fragile. Could it be fragile prophetically? Because if it's true that these invisible spirits, right, the angels of God and the angels of the devil, if they are truly kind of influencing or in charge of these political transitions and how those transitions manifest in the world afterwards, well, then is it possible that this fragility, this fragile state of England is not accidental at all and is actually foreordained, preordained, prophetically guaranteed to be that way? That's the question we're going to aim to answer. And today we are going to learn that nothing at all is accidental. Like personally, I don't even believe in coincidence. That's how strongly I believe that nothing is accidental at all. I believe there was no choice except for Brexit, the British exit from the European Union, except for that to happen. It could not have happened any other way. And we are wise today to expect more of the same from England and from Europe more broadly. So to help us understand why I can say such things so confidently, I want us to study Daniel chapter 2 in this segment. And I'll tell you from the beginning, I could easily spend 90 minutes talking only about this one chapter and still not even tell you everything that I want to say. So you're not going to get a exhaustive Bible study on this here. But maybe we will do an exhaustive Bible study at some point in the future, and maybe we'll link it back here. I don't want to leave you in the lurch. Mostly I'm just kind of whetting your appetite here. But turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. It's Old Testament. Hopefully by now you know where Daniel is. The context here, the broad story is that Daniel is a young man. He's probably an upper teenager by this point, and he has been taken as a political prisoner after King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon waged war against Jerusalem in the nation of Judea and took a whole lot of people captive. And says the Bible says he took the best and brightest of the population captive, made them slaves. So Daniel is a slave in Babylon. He's been there for a couple years by this point. He has been elevated to a position of some stature and prominence because of events in chapter 1. He is considered to be a wise man, even though he is not of the tradition of the Babylonian wise men, but he has such obvious wisdom from God that he is counted among them. So King Nebuchadnezzar begins to have some dreams that trouble him. He's having difficulty sleeping, and the story is that one night he has such a vivid and disturbing dream it actually wakes him up out of his sleep. And he is horrified by it, but he can't quite remember it. I mean, does that ever happen to you? You ever wake up, you know you just had a powerful dream, but you just can't quite reach it? So that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes on this almost tantrum, demanding that his astrologers and wise people tell him what it was he dreamed last night and what it means. And they, of course, can't do that. And so they kind of go on and on about how it's not fair to ask that and blah, blah, blah. But Nebuchadnezzar wants nothing to do with that. He says, you're going to tell me what I dreamed, or else that means you're not doing your job. You're all lying to me, and therefore I'm just going to kill you all. And he makes that decree. All you wise people are liars. Death to all of you. And the army goes around murdering these people. And they show up at Daniel's house because he is a wise man. And so like, hey, time has come to kill you. Daniel says, well, I have no idea what's happening. Can you please explain it to me? And he gets this explanation, and he says to the man who has showed up in his house to kill him, he says, give me one day. I'm going to pray about it to God, and by the grace of God, he will give me the answer the king wants. And so he gets this one-day reprieve, and he prays about it with his friends that evening, goes to sleep, and while he's sleeping, the Lord answers the prayer. He gives Daniel the same dream that he had given to the king, along with what it means. So Daniel wakes up, and he prays a prayer of thanksgiving and goes to the king and tells the king what it was he dreamed and what it means. So that's the big context. If you want to follow along, we are going to read the content of the dream starting in verse 31. And I'm just going to read it, okay? We'll stop to take it apart when I'm done. But starting in verse 31, Daniel says, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So it's a statue. It's a statue of a man, but it's made of various metals, gold at the top, silver underneath that, bronze around the belly and thigh area, legs made out of iron, and feet still made of iron, but with clay mixed in. We don't know what these things mean yet, but once we have a picture of the whole statue, a rock, like a meteor, flies out of the sky, smashes the statue into a gazillion pieces, and then the wind just blows it away like it never existed in the first place, and that meteor rock grows up and becomes like a replacement Earth. What in the world does that mean? Well, because we're limited in time here, I'm just going to tell you what it means, but you can read it for yourself from verse 36 down to verse 45. That's the content of Daniel's explanation of the dream. But what he says really is that each one of those metals represents a different kingdom on the earth. Starting with the head made out of gold, he says that represents King Nebuchadnezzar specifically and the kingdom of Babylon broadly. Therefore, the chest and arms made out of silver represent the subsequent kingdom that will come and overthrow Babylon, and that is Medo-Persia. You notice how there are two arms on a man, and so the symbolism is very kind of right in front of your face. Media, Persia, two arms joined together in one chest, right? And then at the bronze, the belly and thighs made out of bronze would then be the next kingdom that supersedes Medo-Persia, and that is the kingdom of Greece, historically speaking. The legs of iron would be the kingdom that overthrows Greece, and that would be Rome, historically speaking. But then the statue ends. It changes. The feet are still made of iron, but there's something mixed in there. But the prophecy actually says nobody comes and conquers that fourth kingdom of Rome. It just kind of divides, falls apart. And our history books support that. Rome got too big, too kind of drunk on its own excesses, and then it split into two kingdoms, and the Western kingdom just deteriorated after that point until it collapsed in the late 400s AD. Just totally collapsed. So, what happened after that? Well, your encyclopedias will tell you that the church system that existed in Europe at the time, which coalesced and became what we call the Catholic Church today. At the time, it was really just kind of a loose confederation of Christian churches that were increasingly under the political dominance of the church based in Rome. So that's how the Roman Catholic Church, came into being. But at the time, it wasn't really known as that. That church system stepped into the void that was left over when the Roman government voted itself out of existence and then dissolved. The whole of Rome and Italy and Europe was in a complete mess. And so the leader, the bishop of the church in Rome, stepped into that gap and kind of commanded the unity that then led over the following 1,200 years or so to what is collectively known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, that kind of feudal system overseen by the church that existed all throughout Europe for more than 1,000 years. There is one specific verse, though, that I want to look at. I'm just kind of summarizing for you for the sake of time, but let's look at this verse specifically. I'm looking at verse 42 and 43, so it's two verses, okay? Speaking about those feet that are still made of iron, representing Rome, but now it's got this clay mixed into it also. Verse 41 tells us that the iron kingdom of Rome will be divided, and so the feet made of iron and clay are after that division. Something happens to it. Verse 42 says, "As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile." Wow, all right, so that's a change. Rome, as an empire, was so strong and powerful that it just kind of crushed everything else. You can look up the Pax Romana, P-A-X, not P-O-X. Pax Romana means the Roman peace. It was this period of time where the world was more or less at peace. But it was not because they all formed a United Nations and were playing guitar and getting along. It's because Rome was so brutal, it just crushed and destroyed all of its enemies. So it's peace through strength, so to speak. After the collapse of Rome, prophetically, that's not true anymore. Now it's a fragile kind of a situation where it's partly strong, but also partly fragile, and it's got both of these elements in it. Verse 43 says, "As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they," so implicitly that's the people that are represented by all of this, or the nations that are represented by all of this, "they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." The seed of men, I mean, we're all grown-ups here, right? The seed of men means the families, the royal families are intermarrying. They're trying to achieve peace through marrying their families together and creating children that are, partly English and partly German and partly whatever, so that the nations aren't going to fight. But the prophetic promise is they're going to fight anyway. They're going to do this to try to bring themselves together, but they shall not cleave one to another any more than iron mixes with clay. So when we really take the time to parse out all of this prophetic language, we see that we're talking about the continent of Europe and all the nations that make it up. And God is making us a promise here that no matter what, those nations will not actually hold together. So we saw this as early as the 700s AD, when Charles the Great, known as Charlemagne the Great, he tried to unite the whole continent through warfare, and it failed. Surprise, surprise. And then, of course, the royal families try to marry themselves into peace, and that failed, of course. Napoleon Bonaparte from France tried again to war the entire continent together, and that failed. He was defeated by the Russian winter. Russian winter defeats everything. So he failed to do it. Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and 40s tried to war the entire continent together, and he failed too. Right now, the European Union is trying to hold the continent together economically, and that appears to be working for the time being. But you know, in 2015, when England made their vote to remove themselves out of that union, the whole wide world was totally flustered by this. All the markets tanked. Everyone was panicked. You know, my response when I turned on the TV or my phone or however I learned about that at the time, I read it and I said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Because they shall not cleave one to another any more than iron mixes with clay. So, although I could spend a lot more time talking about this prophecy, that's really the nugget that I want to pull out of it for today. Europe is a fragile place. It's already fallen apart insofar as Britain is no longer part of it. It's been falling apart economically since like 2008, when the great big recession happened, and you know, Ireland went broke, and Italy went broke, and Greece went broke, and Spain went broke. And essentially we've had Germany bailing out all of the other member states for the last decade and a half. It is a very fragile place. And what that means is, prophetically speaking, it's not going to hold together. No matter what King Charles does, or any of the other families who are in charge of the various nations all around the continent, it will not hold together. I mean, something even bigger is coming. And we just need to do a little bit more studying to figure out what that bigger thing is. But let's not, since all of this is in service to exploring the ramifications of the new King of England, let us never, ever stop our thinking and our studying with Charles, okay? Or anybody else. I mean, if he dies, then it'll be, William? I forget. The one who's next in line for the throne, whoever that is. It's none of these people are going to matter, because England is or all of Europe is guaranteed to fall apart, and something will have to happen in the void that is left in all of the world's markets, in all of the world's politics. When it ultimately does fall apart, as God promised that it will, something or someone is going to have to step into that void. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next segment. So, thank you again for joining us. I hope this has been interesting to you. I hope that you're realizing that even with all this data, we're simply only scratching the surface, and that you're going to want to hit that subscribe button and come back as often as we produce something for you to keep learning more. Thank you again for joining us. May God bless you, and I'll see you in the next segment.